Hi, I'm Ted Haftagaber, founder and producer of Live Talks Los Angeles. Thanks for joining us. Since we started over a decade ago, we have brought you hundreds of conversations with storytellers, writers, actors, musicians, humorists, chefs, and thought leaders in business and science. You can watch and hear most of these in our YouTube channel and our podcast. For details, visit livetalksla.org. And now, here's the show you've tuned in to see.
Amber, it's good to see you again.
It's good to see you, my friend.
I like your onesie.
Thank you. It's really hard to pee.
I know.
It's a lot of buttons.
My wife wears onesies, and I'm always like, in an
Yeah.
airport.
Yeah. Oh, that's a choice.
That's a choice. She flew today in a onesie, and I was like, okay. But I mean, it looked
Does
great.
she ask you to help her get out of the buttons?
No. She has that under control,
Okay.
thankfully.
Okay, good.
But I would, happily.
Yes. Because you're a feminist.
Exactly. And as we all know.
And we
that's-
help each other with our
That's what
buttons.
feminism actually is.
That's all it's about, guys.
Just helping one another in the
That's
bathroom.
it. Nothing else.
Birth control.
Who cares?
No, help me with my buttons.
Abortion schmortion.
So, Amber, another day, another book.
Another day, another book. Here we are.
I'm curious, an anthology,
Yeah.
which those are notoriously challenging in that it's a lot more work than you ever think it's going to be. So I would love to know the origin story of this book and why you felt like an anthology was the best way to approach this idea of women's intuition and trusting ourselves.
Yeah, so I've been sort of really interested in this topic since it sort of came to my mind, I think, a little bit in 2017, right around the Tarana Burke's Me Too movement, that era, because there sort of seemed to be this collective intuitive zeitgeist that was happening where people all over the world, and certainly in this country, were sharing their stories en masse. And I remember at that time I had written a piece for the Times, which, if you guys don't know, it was called I'm Done With Not Being Believed. It was one of the biggest pieces, opinion pieces in the Times that year. I was able to publish that because of Roxane, because Roxane's incredible, and whenever you reach out for support, you are always a very kind yes to me. And so that piece was published before Jodi Kantor's story came out about Harvey Weinstein and everything that subsequently happened. But I think most people think that piece I wrote came out after. I share this to say that what I was feeling was something that so many other people were feeling. And I see it continuously happening, this sort of underpinning of a different kind of intelligence, which is parallel and as important as rational thought, and that is intuitive intuitive. And so I was interested in it, and I felt like something that was just going to be a sort of historical lens wouldn't be as interesting if I didn't hear from women across industries and experiences about their relationships to intuition. And for me, it was really important to share stories that were not always pro-intuition or were not clear in what their intuitive process or strength was, but to sort of just look at it through some kind of modern lens. When I started to research it, there was not a book outside of Women Who Run with Wolves that had been written in the last 20 years. And if it was written by a man, and it was usually under the self-help title.
Of course it was. Of course it was. What surprised you most as you started collecting essays for this book? Because I think, having edited an anthology myself, you go into it with an idea of what the book is going to be, and then you see what people actually send you and come to understand that perhaps the book is actually going to be something different, and not in a bad way. So what surprised you most?
Well, I'll say one of the most surprising experiences, which I don't know why it shouldn't be surprising to me, was editing my mom, because it was very, triggering. Because my mom was is the wise woman who has it all figured out, and I'm was very ornery about it and like, Mom, this doesn't make sense to anybody. So we had like quite the the experience editing this piece together, and it turned out to be one of my favorites because, I see how brilliant my mom is. She's a master facilitator. She works for the Ojai Foundation here in Los Angeles. She teaches kids how to sit in dialectical practice and sit in circle and talk to each other and communicate. But even my mom is very unsure of her intuitive intelligence, what her gut tells her. And I think it was not surprising, but it was kind of wonderful to see these women who we love, who are writers and doctors and thinkers and artists, who you would imagine like, oh, they must know everything about what their gut tells them. But to see these essays explored and to see how complicated the journey is, and even just locating where your intuitive muscle is in your body to even learn how to flex it and strengthen it, is in and of itself a really difficult process. So I like to say that the book is not something that is full of answers about intuition, but more of asking questions that I think we should be asking in this day and age, and especially in this political climate.
Yes, when you look at this political climate, I think a lot of us are trying to figure out, what do we do? How do we address some of these issues? And some of our go-to solutions are, of course, policy-based or are based in things that are provable and are tangible. And we do seem to overlook a lot of, I don't want to say the softer sciences because they're not soft, actually. But the sciences, the ideas, the concepts that are more difficult to quantify.
Yeah.
I think a lot about, when I think about intuition, I think about children. In general, children have a really good intuition. Like they're, like when a child doesn't want to go near someone, I'm always like, all right.
Yeah.
All right, Chester. When do you think we start to lose that sense of intuition, or when do we stop trusting it?
Well, I'll speak for, I think the experience of women, and one of the things in the research that I did for the book, I talk about how the first real major act of misogyny that a young girl will face is the denial or the othering of her own bodily autonomy and understanding of her own emotional growth. And this is something I think that hasn't really, is much more of a modern idea in parenting of, letting your child be emotive, supporting their emotional intelligence when they're of a young age, telling girls that it's okay to have big feelings that they're not sure how to define and express. And so I think that for, as far as sort of intuition is concerned, and a lot of the research that I found in the book was that this is such an important part of our knowledge, and it goes hand in hand with rational thought. It's not this thing that's out here. It's not, burning sage and casting spells, though, it can be if you want that. I do that all the time. But it is something that goes hand in hand with our rational intelligence. It is a form of intelligence because Gerd Geigerenzer, who I quote in this book, who's a really brilliant philosopher and psychologist, and he talks about the fact that rational intelligence has a margin of error. There is no one in this room that can say unequivocally, 100% factual, they are married to the right person, they have chosen the right job. There will always be a margin of error in any deductive reasoning choice. And the margin of error is the intuitive intelligence. It's the part of us, the physical self that connects with the rational thought that we have been told to ignore for generations and generations. We have been told, dating back to the ages of women being burned at the stakes, who heard voices, that these voices were not to be followed. And if they were, it was the voice of God. It was not your own voice. So this is something that has been there for a long time. And I think certainly with our young children, and I do think that this is the same for probably young boys, too. I think it is the reason, when I was asked at the Strand in New York, an event that I did there, and saying, do you think this book is not for men and boys because it's women's voices? And I said, absolutely not. I think more men and more boys should be allowed to be in touch with the feminine and not be so violence forward, because that's what our society puts on men. And can you imagine the different world we would live in if we were all allowed to have a connection with our physical selves and our psychological selves in the way that we are told to be outwardly masculine in everything we do, both as women and men, and probably as non-binary people too.
Absolutely. A lot of times in conversations like this, in fact, this morning I was visiting a class at a university and talking about feminism, and a young man named Ashton.
Here we go. It's always Ashton.
Because I essentially said, men are actually probably going to be fine. Historically, they have been fine. They currently are fine, and they probably always will be fine. And he said, well, but what about men who are depressed, et cetera? And I was not able to be mature in my response. But one of the things I was thinking about is that when we talk about things that are feminine, that are grounded in women's experiences and also the experiences of non-binary people, people tend to feel like that means that it's excluding men and that they're not supposed to participate, which is interesting because I think it shows that we have this inherent bias, this way of devaluing all things women.
Yeah.
How do you fight against that sort of urge to devalue something because it's feminine, because it's women's intuition, because it's grounded in personal experience or emotion?
Well, I think that all we can keep doing is keep speaking about it, is to never be quiet about it. And that might sound like a simple idea, and it may not sound like it can solve everything, but I think the more that we are talking about the feminine experience, we are talking about the soft qualities of emotional intelligence and what our bodies tell us, and especially in an age where our connections with people are dictated by algorithms that get to decide for us, on a daily basis, who we are in touch with, who our audience is, what our friendship groups look like. In the digital world, coupled with being in 2 to 3 years of a pandemic where we were not seeing anyone face to face, where we were not able to have conversations like this, let alone arguments and things that are really important for us as human beings, to be able to have face to face combat in any form of face to face love, like to feel things with each other in a room. Is dangerous, and to me kind of like a sign of a crumbling culture. And so when I think about that, I think about continuing to speak about it, presenting essays like this, talking about something that normally feels really cliche and taboo, like intuition. It was when I thought about when I thought about this as an idea, for a book, I thought, oh my God, there must be so many books like this right now. And even my literary agent, who's always believed in everything I've wanted to write, and he's like, I feel like that's a book that's already out there. And I said, I have spent months and months researching it, and it's not, because it is such a taboo subject. And I felt like it really needed, in the wake of, Roe v. Wade wasn't even overturned, but every lawyer I knew in the middle of 2021 was saying, Dobbs is coming, it's gonna be over, no one's listening. They were screaming it from the rooftops in the middle of last year, and it just was not on the forefront of anyone's conversational list. It wasn't on the talk shows, no one was talking about it. But knowing that these things were coming down the pipeline, and then to know the book is out now here in the time of everything that's going on in Iran and everything that's going on with trans rights, with children who are trans, what's happening with their bodily autonomy. I felt like we needed a weapon that was different from the other kind of weapons that we have been fighting with, and something that that is more of a resensitizing us from all the numbness that we have felt in the last couple of years.
How do you want this book to function as a weapon? What do you want people to do with these essays that you've pulled together?
So bring it back to when we were talking about kids. My hope is that the young generation, young boys, young non-binary kids, young trans kids, young girls, teenagers in their early 20s, if they could have a fraction of the intuitive intelligence that women like us have taken decades of, with therapy and work, I'm sure many people in this audience, the experience of defining the ability to trust yourself and what your physical body tells you, combined with your mental intelligence. If the younger generation could get to that in half the time that it has taken all of us as older adults to get there, I feel like we would be in such a much better place. Because we have been conditioned through social media, through everything else, as I just said, to be disconnected in such a large way. My great hope is that younger generations find this book and find this topic, and even if they think they know what the topic is or they know about it, that they'll learn from it. Because it is a book with essays about women's experiences coming to understand what intuition means to them, how it manifests in their body. For some women, that's a literal tightening, a holding in their stomach. For some, their hands go cold, they get ringing in their ears. Some of them don't even know yet. There's a great essay by Jessica Valenti in here, who's a writer, and the last line of it really resonated with me because she says, when I can't trust myself, I can trust my community. And I think that's really a really profound statement. And then at the end of the book, there's sort of like a roadmap that walks people through how to ask themselves a difficult question or make a difficult decision in an attempt to say, let's really put this in practical terms, this thing that is so hard to define, and try to help people walk through a way to strengthen that muscle for themselves. So my hope is that younger generations find this and save themselves a lot of therapy bills.
Absolutely. I really appreciated the practical section at the end, and you made a little booklet too.
I did.
Which covered in black velvet, beautiful. And one of the things I appreciated is that all too often when we do talk about things like this, we leave it as a theoretical.
Yes.
And people are left wondering, okay, but where do I go from here? And that you were able to give people a tangible game plan that is clearly malleable, that
Yes.
people can do with what they need to do and can alter as needed. I thought was incredibly useful. And it showed, for me, a lot of thought into how you assembled this collection. And so I would love to know, what were some other considerations, not only in terms of, how you organized it and putting this sort of roadmap at the end, but also the diverse range of contributors. And I'm using that word in every sense, not merely about demography, but in terms of content.
Yeah. So I knew that there was going to be something at the end that I wanted to feel like a practical, applicable piece of writing that would go through some kind of roadmap. I didn't know what that was going to look like because I myself am, it's hard to define what intuition is, even for me. I know what it looks like. It's taken many years to get there, but to go beyond the tropes of a voice inside or a feeling in your gut. Like, how do you expound on that? How do you go further and really talk about how it manifests for you in your writing, or it manifests for you in medicine or healing or anything that it is that you do? So what I did is as essays came in, I started to pull pieces that felt foundational to me, pieces of that people had written about. For instance, Amy Poehler's piece called Practicing the Quiet is really great because it's about spending your whole life, again, feeling like because you're the funniest person in the room and the way to succeed is to be masculine forward, is to always be the unbreakable one, the one in a world who's like got the quip, got the answer, got the thing, ready to go, like in any room can outdo any man in a conversation or an answer. And in later years, she's found that the quiet place is the most important place because that's when she can start to hear what her body is telling her. This is a total paraphrasing of a much larger essay, but so I would pull out little threads like that. And what I tried to do was weave through what I know to be true about an intuitive question when we ask it of ourselves and our bodies, which is we ask it, and usually, rightly so, our physical selves has a reaction. It has a fight or flight reaction, that the mind jumps in and tries to stop it from happening, especially if it's an answer we don't like. If it's an answer that is, aims to shake up the foundation of our comfort or threaten the survival of our stability of our livelihood, that will be the first reaction that comes in. And so the practical chapter really looks at how to push through that, to pause, to let your body go through whatever it needs to go through, whether that's ignoring it, procrastination, all different forms of things that might come up, and then to see what comes out on the other side when you're able then to sort of be in tune with what your body is saying and seeing that as like a second voice and using those two things together to get to the answer that you're looking for.
In the introduction, which I thought was incredibly powerful, you talk about your writing mentor, really your poetry mentor, who was the first person to read your poems and respond to them, and Jack Hirschman. And this moment where you had the sense that you needed to reach out, that you needed to go see him. How did you come to that moment as really the beating heart of your introduction?
Yeah, so, excuse me while I take a cough drop. Jack was the poet laureate of San Francisco, and he was my mentor since I was a little girl. And this thing had happened, which I share in the essay, about this watch, actually, and a picture of him that had showed up on it and sort of stuck and stayed there while I was away in Canada shooting a show. And sort of seeing time as this, not just a linear measurement of something that was dictating the hours, but was also almost like a stopwatch, taking me towards a moment that was going to happen. And because of this strange thing that we could also just chalk up to as, a fluke, a accident of a piece of hardware, because I took that to mean something, because I didn't see that as just a coincidence, even though it probably was, which is my rational mind saying it probably was, but seeing it as something as telling me to contact him is the reason we were able to have a last phone call, even that. And I'd planned to go see him when I came back into the country and go to San Francisco, but he died before I got to see him. And when I was thinking about this book after I had sold the idea, that was something that I knew the book was going to start there, because it felt like such a perfect example of this idea of following your gut, of what intuitive intelligence can look like if you follow the signs. And it's not always right. It doesn't always give you the outcome that you're looking for. But there is a power in listening to that kind of reception from your body that is telling you something that you might otherwise not be listening to. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to use that as sort of an example of entering into the space of looking for signs and listening to what the body tells you.
In your mother's essay, she talks about that connection between intuition and mindfulness, mm-hmm. which really made me feel like this is something that not only we might have inherently, but that you can cultivate, because mm-hmm. we can teach ourselves to be mindful, to pay more attention, to listen to ourselves, to pay attention to our communities, to anything. And so what are some things that we might be able to do to tap into this sense of mindfulness?
I love that. That's a great question. It's so interesting too, because mindfulness and intuition are basically just, the same thing as cognitive behavioral therapy to a degree, but that's something that we trust more because it comes out of a more clinical terminology and something that we understand and therefore we believe to be true, which is psychology. But I think mindfulness and a way to begin that approach. I think I have a conversation with America Ferrera in the book too that I really love, and she talks a lot about this idea of putting yourself out there, and you might be like shaking, you might be terrified. She talks about this experience of wanting to direct a TV show for the first time that she was a producer on, and even just asking to do that made her physically ill, and she had to like go back to her trailer, and she was crying, and she's like, why are you so upset? This is what you wanted. But and she said she had to go then sit, and she sort of talked to herself like a parent would to a child, and would say, you know, what are the feelings that you're having? What is this? What is it that? What are you upset about? Are you afraid that they're gonna not like you? Are you afraid that they're gonna say no? Well, you can hear a no. That's okay. No is okay. And it turned out that it was like this fear of not being liked that she had to push through and say, it's okay not to be liked, to be seen for asking for this thing as something that I'm not, because the more that I push past it, the more I lean into the most authentic version of who I am and keep showing that to the world is going to keep seeing that, even the most shitty Hollywood men, producers. Like, that is going to be the inevitability of me pushing past my own fears. So with the mindfulness idea, I would say that we have to find what works for us, which is kind of why the roadmap at the end, I think, is helpful, because I think it's so unique to everybody. Everyone has their own pathways, their own ways of experiencing it. But to really start doing things that center you in your body, connect you relationally to nature and to an understanding of your physical self in the physical world, not just on our phones, on social media, texting our friends, but being physically present in our bodies and in the world, and then taking the cues of our body as language, as words that are telling us something about an outcome. So I think finding ways to be in relationship with your body is sort of the first step. And then going from there, you are just strengthening a muscle when you are asking yourself something that feels very scary, and doing the thing that Henry Miller would say, which is all growth is a leap in the dark. And so just doing the thing that scares you the most. In Samantha Irby's essay, and everything she does is, I think, incredibly wonderful. She's so great. And humane and hilarious. Yeah. And she gives voice to a litany of questions that are really connecting her anxiety and intuition. And I really thought that was an interesting approach, because oftentimes when we think about intuition, we're thinking about sort of like forecasting things. And with anxiety, it's about sort of like drilling down and really getting into like, what are my fears here? I'm curious, what kinds of questions do you ask yourself as you're doing anything creative that's scary, that's overwhelming, that you have these anxieties around? I think similarly to America, there is a sense of asking myself what I have to lose, what it is that I'm really afraid of, why it is that I'm afraid to put myself out there in this specific way. What is the door that feels like it's closed? And checking in to see, because that's also, we talk about it in the book, a lot of different people do, the difference between anxiety and intuition. And sometimes they are very confusable. They're very hard to tell the difference. Or one is sort of pointing you towards something that is very scary but thrilling and feels like there is an outcome, where the other one, sometimes anxiety feels more like a downward spiral. It feels like it's going towards nothing. And that can feel more comfortable because that's pulling you away from the determinant that is actually going to give you the answer that you are looking for ultimately. Whether or not that's an answer you like, it's so much easier to lean into anxiety. So with Sam and I, when I said, how does it look for you when you're about to write an essay? Like, what is the process? Not just like, I hear an idea, I have a sentence. And she says, I go through like rapid fire, shitting on myself questions that are filled with anxiety and filled with terror and excited and all of these things. And I said, great, let's write out all the questions, which are in the essay. So you can kind of see how she goes through this process of thinking about how people are going to see her, how people are going to relate to her, what they're going to think of her writing. Are they going to hate it? But that's part of her process. Like, process is really important. Procrastination is really important. Doing things.
Yes, it is.
It is. Go answer all those emails that you do not need to answer and say yes to all those things that you're going to regret later and try to back out of. That's my go-to. But that's sometimes part of your process, and I think getting to the root of that for any individual person is really important and part of sort of being in tune and alignment with the way in which you move through the world.
Mm-hmm. Near the end of the book, you ask readers about opening the window inside oneself and listening. Mm-hmm. And so I'm curious, what do you hear when you open your window?
Besides Beyonce songs?
I mean, obviously.
That's all I usually hear.
I was listening to Beyonce on the drive here.
So was I. What song were you listening to?
I was listening to Ego.
Ego's so
Just
good.
classic.
I was listening to
Underrated.
Energy.
You're listening to what?
Energy.
Oh,
It's a really good song.
Cuff It.
Cuff It's a really good song, too.
Man, I'm like, yes, girl, let's cuff it.
Oh, God.
Mm-hmm. I finally mastered the little dance. Just
You
FYI.
did?
I did, and it's embarrassing to say because it's a very simple dance. However, God did not give me that skill set.
But that's amazing.
I know.
And I'll bet
really
you feel
proud.
really good when you do it.
Oh, I do. I do it all the time now. I'm just like, ha ha, I'm gonna make a video.
Welcome to our Beyonce appreciation panel. Tonight's guest is Roxane Gay. What do I hear? I hear, it's kind of like when I meditate, I hear similar things where there's an essay in the book where I talk a lot about I don't even know if you call it a relationship with the late actress Brittany Murphy, mm-hmm. and my sort of obsession with her life around the time she had died, and how that turned into this really powerful poem that was called Brittany Murphy, that ended up in Dark Sparkler, which was a book that sort of was a pathway for me. It was a door that had opened to a different kind of person, to a more authentic person that I wanted to become and that I already knew I was, but I wanted the world to see. And I had visualized when I was writing that poem, and this sounds kind of crazy, but I had visualized kind of like I talk about in the book, the scene in, oh my gosh, what is it? The Woody Allen film where Diane Keaton stands up out of herself out of the bed. And I was seeing that in like reverse with this sort of Brittany Murphy sitting down inside of me and sort of becoming a part of myself. And it was like a visualized experience of having this hurt young girl who had been abused and objectified in one of the cruelest industries in the world, having a place to be safe. And I would imagine her younger inside of me almost. And it helped me write that poem for her. And so for me, when I think about this window, and I think about when you're open to a listening, to something that is impossible to describe, but clear, I think about that space as a place where, for as hokey as it might sound, like her ghost, a part of her ghost resides, mm-hmm. which is a part of my ghost, my childhood experience as a child actress, and all the ghosts of young girls that had experienced that and watched a part of themselves die because of it. And I very much felt reborn from my experience of writing that book. And part of my muscle, my intuitive strength, has been to strengthen the idea that I carry within me a lot of stories, that I've not just been a storyteller my whole life, but that I carry them inside of me, both the literal and the fictional, the real ones and the fictional ones, and that I'm there to be in service to those voices and to those stories. And so I always kind of imagine it as a space where those many different stories and voices are housed. And I'm listening to hear the conversations. I'm listening to hear what they're saying and what they're telling me and what they want the world to hear.
That's very moving. This idea of listening to many voices. I think that we don't appreciate enough because we talk about listening to ourselves, which I do think is incredibly important, and too many of us don't trust ourselves, but the idea that we can also learn from other voices is critical. And actually, because there are other voices here in the room, I think this might be a good moment to take some questions from
Yes,
the audience.
indeed.
What advice you would have for teachers working with young children to see that the intuition doesn't get burned out of them?
What a phenomenal question. You know, I've been asked a couple times in some events that I've done in New York over the last couple of days what I do with my own daughter. She's 5 years old. I think one of the first things is I always, as Roxane was kind of saying, like, what do kids think of adults? What do they think of people? How do people make them feel? How do stories make them feel? I think validating their opinions in a world that says, you know, kids should not be giving their opinions on things for the most part, like that what they're thinking is just magical, mystical nonsense. I think taking it seriously and doing things that help kids check in with their bodies, so whether that's breathing exercises, creating story about what lives in the gut, what kind of special person or creature or story lives there, and just reminding them that their physical selves are alive and also speak, that language is not just, words that come out of our mouth, that it's also something that our bodies tell us, and that if we listen very closely, we can hear that. So I know with Marlo, with my daughter, I'm always, talking to her when she started mentioning butterflies in her stomach, and so we've created stories about what the butterflies say, and how the butterflies talk to each other. And I want her to really feel like her body is something that speaks to her, and that it is, even more than that, something that she should trust above all else, even more than what her own mother tells her. So I think maybe that something in there might be great for kids in thinking of bodily autonomy and what the physical self can teach us, and what we can help kids to understand about their own bodies as really important tools in communication and understanding.
I've been thinking about the extent to which people whose intuition seem to be very much intact have been pulled off center by the sort of collective shadow that's rising, not only in our culture but across the world. And I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about knowing the difference between your own intuition and that collective that's pushing us so much these days. I don't know if that question makes sense.
No, it does. I mean, I think I talked in a little bit in the beginning of the program about a sort of collective intuitive uprising, which took place in 2017. It's happening in Iran right now. It's really powerful. That what is happening there is a connected intuitive resistance that is happening amongst women all over the country. In a different kind of way, but that is something that comes from the gut. It comes from this thing that's telling you this is not right, and and everyone is going to speak. So I think that there are different forms of it. In the book, Huma Abedin actually writes about, which I thought was really fascinating, the women of Hillary Land, so the women who worked in the White House in Hillary Clinton's cabinet, and talking about them as sort of an intuitive body. That they became, like, all of these women would work together and they barely had to say anything about anything. They just knew. They functioned as like one large intuitive brain. And I thought that was such a cool example, not only of like something that felt very feminist to me, and this idea of women working together and working well together, but also just the idea that an intuitive process is not just for a single person sometimes. It is for a movement. It is for a body of people. And so I think sometimes we become a part of that, depending on what the world is offering. And sometimes it's just for us. But again, I think if if you are working towards strengthening that muscle and strengthening the connection and the belief in yourself, the trust in yourself, and not just yourself in what you think, but in this body, even if you hate it at times, even if you have a lot of different feelings about it at times, but if there is a trust in what it tells you, and that there's a trust in the connection between the two, that will, to me, always outweigh the shadow. And so when we have more and more people doing that, then we are, in a way, creating a, place where it's almost impenetrable. That's my hope, anyway, is that we will get to a point where that is something that is so strong for us, this intelligence, this part of us, that it can outweigh the shadow, and it can be something that we aren't, getting sucked into something that is not our own belief, that is not true to us. I think in the same way that we do that with art, we want to create art and writing and books. We want to be in service to ourselves, to the voices inside, like I spoke about, and not in service to creating work for somebody else just to please them. That's the goal.
Hi. I wanted to ask, if you're feeling intuitive, do you also get a physical feeling just like your daughter, when she has butterflies in her stomach?
Do I get a physical feeling?
Yeah.
I do. I get very tired, and then if I lay down, I usually have very intense visions. I see things that are related to something. It becomes kind of like a tightening of my whole body. I feel like something is kind of holding it down. And this can be for a good reason too. Even when thinking about the book and leaning into that as sort of an idea. I'm very in tune now, or much more than I used to be, with when my body is sort of telling me something is right or wrong. And then sometimes I'm not correct about what I'm guessing it could be, and I have to sit and I meditate and I try to think about what my body is telling me, and I try to think about what is trying to come through. And sometimes, even creatively, that, as I mentioned, comes with a lot of boring work, procrastination, things that have nothing to do with writing, have nothing to do with creating, but just letting myself do those things because it's the way I process until I get to the point where I'm ready to do it.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting and thought-provoking. What about the fact that, if I have that intuition, I feel like something is, I have that gut feeling about something, but I don't have, I'm in a situation, I keep thinking about privilege, and some people, me as a white woman or a woman who has someone, someone to fall back on, right? I can speak up more than somebody who can't. So what about people, what if we have that intuition, but we don't have that privilege to be able to say, I'm gonna speak up, I'm gonna risk maybe losing a job, or whatever that thing is that we could lose, that we depend on, or people that depend on us also depend on. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think that an intuitive process isn't always about speaking up. It's not always about putting yourself out there. It's not about taking what you know and then applying it in the real world. Applying it in the real world is one of the choices. The strengthening of the intuitive intelligence and that part of yourself is, to my mind anyway, an option. And once you have the options, then you can, I think, have a better understanding of what an outcome can be and what you can do with it. But it doesn't necessarily mean that a person has to, and certainly it's very different for white women or white people as it is not white people. And so I think it depends on what the aim is that you ultimately want to do, what you're asking of your body, what you're asking to hear of the experience and the outcome that you're looking for.
Hi, thank you again for such a wonderful conversation. Something that came up, I think, earlier in the program was this sort of idea of institutionally discounting feminine ideas or behaviors. And I'm sort of, I guess it makes me curious about sort of where intuition fits into the mainstream value system. You know, obviously everybody in this room like understands the power of intuition and self-reflection, but I'm curious about your opinion on sort of like the larger zeitgeist, you know, and how we sort of sell this to people as something that's valuable.
Well, again, I think I spoke a little bit about where I think we're at as a culture, of how disconnected we've all become. And I think I'm very interested and invested in resensitizing us to our bodies and to what they tell us and to this really important piece of intelligence that we have otherwise kind of ignored and put on the sidelines. I think that it will take a lot of time for that to happen, for that to become a mainstream idea, and it may not even be a term like intuition. To me, that's a fact-based form of knowledge that we can use, and so that's a term that I want to use. I want to put it out there. I want it to be destigmatized and not feel like something that is, again, like a hippie, dippy, silly thing that we, you know, that is just a part of spiritualism and nothing else, because it's very real. Its manifestation is really very real. It is something we can practically use. And I think as long as we're talking about it, as long as we're creating work that reflects it, as long as we're using it and talking about how we're using it, whether or not we're sharing what the answer is for us, that's a small way to begin. You know, if we're all doing that here tonight, and I'm, you know, I'm sure half the people in this room also don't have that relationship with themselves and are curious to explore it more. I know for me, that was not something that I was thinking about even just a few years ago. This idea of the voice inside and what the gut tells you and even following that. So I think it's little by little, and my hope, as I said, is that we'll have future generations of kids that are much more connected. I feel that way already with so many of my friends' kids who are just such different thinkers and deeper feelers than we ever could be, and they're not afraid of their emotions. And they're also not afraid of, you know, connecting their social lives with their political lives. Those things are entwined for them, whereas I grew up in a generation where those things were very separate, and it was crazy to be talking about politics and the political, you know, in your daily life in that way. So my hope is just that it's like going to be a lot about the next generations that come up, and that if we can teach them how to trust their bodies and trust their own intelligence and the different forms of intelligence that we have, that things will begin to change little by little.
Would you comment on the willingness to believe or consider your intuition based on where the stage in life one is, say a teenager or somebody in their 20s or somebody later more established in life? Is there a difference in the willingness to accept?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think my mom writes about this in the book, and she's in her 70s. And Amy Poehler also writes beautifully about sort of becoming wiser towards these things as you get older. I think it's so interesting, you know, you go through these phases where as a child, there is such a pure connection to what your intuition tells you, to what your body tells you, to what you think and what you feel, and emotions are so real and not something to be ridiculed, or, you know, your entire emotional livelihood is not something to be told, you know, that it shouldn't exist, that it shouldn't be out there. And then as we get older, we are conditioned to become more a part of society and to start to ignore those things, those parts of ourselves. And this is where you will find Dr. Nicole Appelian, who's a survivalist and a scientist and a doctor, writes in the book a lot about this, about reconnecting with her body to heal it. And she actually healed herself of MS. She talks about this in the book. But the lengths of process it took to get there, all through her 20s and her 30s, to come out on the other side in her 40s and have a real understanding of all of the signs her body had given her, of the ways in which it could be healed. that she ignored for so many years. And so I think, of course, with time and age, you get to understand things a lot better, and you become more in tune and more in practice with what your intuition and what your gut might be telling you, and it might become easier to follow it. But that only comes with practice. That comes with flexing it like a muscle, using it, and not just and not ignoring it, which is what we've all been sort of conditioned to do. So I think there's a period of time in our 20s and 30s where we can forget about that, and we get rid of it, and we don't apply it in our everyday lives. And then hopefully you kind of come back to it later on in life. Or hopefully, what I want is just for us to be able to say our kids are going to do better, and they're going to be able to have that because they're going to be raised in a better way to trust themselves more, to trust what their bodies tell them, so that they won't go through these big decade-long gaps of feeling totally disconnected from their livelihoods and from their interior lives.
As you're going through your life practicing this intuition, listening to your intuition, what do you say to yourself in those moments, and how do you care for yourself in the moments where you followed your intuition, or you feel like you followed it at least, and the outcome isn't what you expected, or you regret it?
That happens often, but I'll tell you that I feel better when I do follow it, even if I'm wrong, even if the outcome is something that is disappointing, that it's not something I would have hoped for. Being true to myself and to what I think I know to be true about myself and my needs, no matter what, I will always feel better about following that than ignoring it. Because when I ignore it, that's when I get down on myself, and that's when I know that I've not given myself the ultimate pathway towards what can be true for me. So I think that sometimes it can be right, sometimes it can be wrong. It's not really about one of those two things. Again, it's about having options and about knowing a truth for yourself that could be something that decides an outcome in your life, and it is to be used or it is not to be used. It's either one of those things, but the way to find, I think, the true authentic part of yourself is to be in conversation and to be trusting of what your body and your mind tell you, and not just to follow this sort of rational part of ourselves that is dictating according to what it's been conditioned to believe to be true, for what your life is supposed to be, for what any outcome is supposed to be, if that answers it.
Hi, thank you guys so much. My question is more about the writing process and how your intuition plays into that, and if you have self-care tips that are your favorite go-tos in terms of writing about very difficult things.
Frequent masturbation.
Wow.
I mean, she wanted some tips.
Literally.
Hey. I mean, I think creativity, writing is funny, and I've said this before, Jack Hirschman, who I wrote the essay about, would always tell me, you have to write every day. If you want to be a writer, you have to write every day. And that might have been true for Jack Hirschman. That is not true for me. And it wasn't until, my other late writing mentor was Wanda Coleman, she's a poet, a poet from here in Los Angeles. And she would say there's no such thing as writer's block. You have to let the muse sleep. Sometimes that takes a while. Sometimes she sleeps a lot. But to know and to trust your process, and that everyone's process is different. So when it comes to writing, when it comes to creativity, for me anyway, I had to spend a lot of years finding out the way in which I approach my work. That was not the books I had read, it wasn't Stephen King's on writing, it wasn't everyone else's process, it had to be my process, which was going to look like no one else's process. And that also included my voice. You come to a point in your life where you're no longer writing like your mentors, You are finding out the thing you have to say uniquely and the way in which you say it uniquely. To me, those are the two things that are the most important to nurture, and to find out how you come to a writing process is just really by trial and error, and figuring out what it is, knowing the cues, knowing the things that you do to get there. So, you know, for me, as I mentioned, I'm a big procrastinator. So like it takes a long time, and I do a bunch of other stuff before I ever even sit down. And then sometimes I'll sit down and I'll write a sentence or two. And I'm also a big believer in don't, you know, get upset with yourself about bad writing off the top. Like you don't go in and start editing immediately, because you have to let yourself sort of find the rhythm, and the rhythm comes to you if you know and you feel it and you've let it do its process long enough that you are familiar with it. And that is, again, being part of like being really, really, really familiar with your creative, intuitive side. So knowing how it comes to you is as important as knowing how to write itself. Like knowing what it is you are going to write and how you write is being respectful of the process. And again, it's just trial and error. I think you have to sit and see and think about it. Really think when you're doing it, when you have an idea for a poem or a book or an essay or whatever it is you're writing. And I'm talking about in the beginning, you know, when you're cultivating it. You really want to think about the ways in which you show up to the page. What are the things you do? Do you need to have your favorite pillow? Do you need to be in a dark room? Do you need to be in front of a giant window with a lot of light? What works for you? What for you uniquely, not just for the people that you've read, the way that they write, and protect those things at all costs.
And our final question for the evening.
Thank you so much for this really wonderful conversation. What was the most surprising thing you learned about intuition in doing this book?
The most surprising thing that I learned, which I shared a little bit, was that it is real, it is tangible, it is studied. It is, again, it's not a thing that lives out here. It is something that is not just a feeling. It is a physical manifestation. It is a very real form of intelligence that fits the margin of error that rational thought and rational intelligence and knowledge does not account for. It is the margin of error. And when Gerd Gigerenzer presented it in that way and talks about, decisions with decision making, that not all outcomes cannot be known. It's just not possible. And so the only thing left is the intuitive intelligence, is the guess, is what the body tells you. I think it really solidified something for me about my own truth and about the truth of this conversation, which was understanding how powerful it is and why it's been something that we've been conditioned to believe is not valuable. Emotional intelligence, all of these things we have been othered from and told that it is not something we should lean on or rely on. And in fact, scientifically speaking, we should. We absolutely should. And there's a lot of work in there in the book about that, looking at why it is something that is absolutely functional and real, and not just a part of spiritualism, as we sometimes believe it to be.